record will show.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to rise and speak on this bill. Good things take time, they say, and this issue has taken some time to be resolved. In fact, there are a few members over there, and the chairman of the committee, who I acknowledge, who handled this situation very, very well. He was around in 1996, I believe, when he came in 98. Well, indeed, I was here in 96 when the Fisheries Act was passed. And I want to lay some groundwork for this, acknowledge the sterling effort of my previous colleague, Graham Kelly, who was the champion for New Zealand fishermen. And he, in the passage of the bill under the previous national government, fought for, and it was a hard fight, to ensure that people working on boats in New Zealand waters were at least entitled to the same terms and conditions of any ordinary hard-working Kiwi, regardless of what nationality they were, and regardless of what boat they were on, Mr. Speaker. And he won that argument at the time, and it was implemented in the Act of 96, but it became apparent that, in fact, the implementation of that law was not occurring. And, in fact, when we came into government in 99, it was thereabouts, and the Speaker, you will probably recall this yourself, we then did a review of the situation, and it asked the question, is this law, are these terms and conditions being imposed? The fact was they weren't. The Department of Labour, they've been doing in a few areas, I have to say, since then, as well as back at that day, were not, in fact, checking on the conditions of people working on these boats. And then there was, an extended period before we had some action. And I can applaud the government that finally, following the sinking of the Ouyang boat in the Southern Ocean, saw the need to investigate this further, and there was an inquiry. Again, previous colleague, the Honourable Paul Swain, conducted that inquiry and came up with some recommendations that were effectively put into legislation. Now, the Select Committee has looked at this, and the proposal was to effectively flag all the vessels as New Zealand vessels and ensure that anyone catching fish in New Zealand's economic zone, and it is a very big area, that they are on New Zealand boats or flagged under the New Zealand flag, and they are entitled to the terms and conditions that any good Kiwi would expect. Not easy life out there, Mr. Speaker, and I can acknowledge the great work done in my hometown of Westport, where a fishing school trained young Kiwis who were a bit lost into the fishing industry to earn really good money on New Zealand boats out catching New Zealand fish, and we want to see that continue. What we had, of course, with the allocation of quota to smaller iwi groups, and we've got, of course, iwi owning the vast majority of the biggest chunk of quota in this country, effectively caught through Sealord, but there were smaller iwi groups, of course, who were relying, and other bigger companies, relying on foreign charter vessels to catch either highly migratory species or fish that came in over short seasons, and, as I say, smaller groups that couldn't afford to go out and catch or buy a boat. If I can go back one step, Mr. Speaker, to the New Zealandisation, which was a term used through the 90s to encourage New Zealand quota owners in the fishing industry to buy boats owned, controlled and crewed by New Zealanders. And it was a very patriotic and a very visionary approach that ran well for a number of years, but then ran foul, I guess, of short-term management thinking, of cost pressures or whatever. And so when we had built up a reasonable fleet of New Zealand boats, in fact we've seen that shrink back, and the increasing use of foreign charter vessels. On these boats, arguably, we have people who are working in slave-like conditions. There's no other way for that. We've heard numerous reports from crew who have come into New Zealand ports, walked off their boats, demanded to have payment from their owners or from the owners of the boats, and they have described to colleagues, both on this side of the House and that side of the House, atrocious conditions that no person can tolerate, let alone a government that is mandated to ensure fairness and some kind of equity and some human rights in this country. And indeed, we had people catching fish in the New Zealand Economic Zone who were treated like slaves, who had no guarantee of receiving payment and salaries and remuneration for their efforts when they got back home. They were effectively held to ransom, and on a boat in the middle of the Southern Ocean or middle of the Pacific Ocean, that's not a great place to be. Mr. Speaker, this bill, when it proceeds, will ensure that all those boats catching the fish will be New Zealand flagged, with the exception of some research vessels. Now, that wasn't the proposal in the bill. In fact, it's not the proposal in the bill that I hold in my hand, but the Minister said that she will introduce an SOP. And that's come about as a result of last-minute interventions that no one on the Select Committee had any idea how it had occurred. I have my suspicions that the government succumbed to some lobbying from the Māori Party and some iwi groups, that they sought an exception.
Too busy hosting them to dinner.
Well, that's probably one of the discussions that came out of one of those dinners, no doubt. $5,000 to pay to go to a dinner and get this an exemption put in a bill like this is certainly a good investment, and it's probably how it happened. But I'm not going to dwell on that issue. I think it's all very clear and apparent to anyone who's got half a brain, actually, what happened here. Nonetheless, the government, through maybe another dinner held with another group of people from the fishing industry, no doubt, was convinced that the exemptions put up for iwi and for other groups were in fact unsustainable. That is, it was going to be difficult, if not impossible, to ensure that the spirit and objective of the bill, that is to ensure proper wages and conditions for people working on these boats, it was going to be difficult to ensure that was upheld if we had exemptions for foreign charter vessels for pretty much any reason. So the Minister, in his or her wisdom, and the Cabinet in their not wisdom, I don't know, or because of a dinner or something, they've done an about-turn on this. And we shouldn't criticise the government, because for once in their life, they've finally made the right decision. And I think the members of the Select Committee from all parties could see that this bill needed to be passed. No fair-minded Kiwi could continue to accept the conditions on these foreign charter vessels. They are nothing but floating dungeons. And as we saw with the Young 70, that's indeed what happened for too many of these poor fishing workers. Mr. Speaker, the government has done an about-turn. We welcome that. We're not going to ask the question why. But this will now enable the fishing industry to catch its own fish. We hope and we expect to process that fish in New Zealand or on New Zealand boats, and to add value here in this economy and get out and sell this high-value protein to the rest of the world. At this point, the fishing industry is not doing a great job in that area, and they have to be encouraged and assisted, maybe through things like accelerated depreciation or whatever, to get new modern boats, to catch them, freeze them down quickly, process them, and have the highest quality fish protein for the world's most discerning markets. That is the objective we must have from what is one of the biggest economic zones in the world, one of the biggest areas of fisheries available to any country. We have got this jewel. It's run by a reasonably good quota management system, not perfect, but Mr. Speaker, this bill enables everyone working on those boats to have at least a decent wage, to live in a boat that is not a dungeon, and to actually adhere to and uphold the conditions that were laid down in the 1996 Fisheries Act, fought for by my colleague, that indeed New Zealand wages and conditions are owed to anyone working in this country.
Shane Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rise in support of the Fisheries Foreign Charter Vessel